Welcome back, everybody, to your daily update to the state of the Malazan Empire. And today we're going to continue talking about Book 3 of Memories of Ice. Well, first, of course, there's the update to the knitting project. It has grown alarmingly. It's At this point, I feel that we're reaching the point where it's kind of difficult to show progress, sort of, because, you know, up like after a certain point it just feels like there's 10 centimeters more, but they don't look like 10 centimeters. I'll just drape it around my shoulders and we'll see how far this goes down already. So I suspect that I might be able to finish this at the end of House of Chains, the latest, is what I'm trying to say. I don't want to say I'll be done with this at the end of Memories of Ice, because I doubt that will be the case. Anyway, I'm pretty sure you'll see maybe a slightly larger, progress after the weekend. As I said before, I'll try to do something that's not just the Malazan read-through tomorrow and on Sunday. It might still be Malazan related, it's just more abstract. But today we're still on the daily grind. We're going through Memories of Ice. Cheers. All right. So what are the main things I want to talk about today from Book 3? That's a good question. There's a lot of world building stuff happening. I'm gonna, touch on those things just slightly, because I don't see this as like my main strength. I just want to, I feel like I want to pull out more the other stuff that I feel is interesting. So let's get some of those things quickly out of the way. This goes on at the same time as Deadhouse Gates. You remember, there's this short vision that Ganoas Paran has on the roof of the building where Gruntle and the other Creachians are hanging out. And Paran has this short vision of the Jade monolith. He thinks it's monolith because he thinks in terms of the Deca dragons, but obviously from what we see, that's the situation, that moment when Heborik pulls down Fenner out of his own war and his own world, because, well, he doesn't do it on purpose. It's Baudin who pushes his hand on, who does that thing. You know what I mean. Anyway, so that gives us roughly an idea of which elements have happened already, which haven't, compared to Deadhouse Gates. So just for those of you who want to keep track of those things. We learn a lot more about Heborik at this point. We also learn more about, there's this quick chapter heading epigraph that's an excerpt from some Temple Lives, which I assume is sort of hagiographic, with hagiography within the Temple of Fenner. Hagiography, if you remember, or if you don't know, is basically hero tales of church heroes. It's a religious biography. Anyway, there's this short thing about the Destriant, and there we learn that technically our good friend Heborik was supposed to be Fenner's Destriant, which is High Priest, as we already know. And he obviously didn't turn out to be that, because he got kicked out. And that epigraph just says, that epigraph basically just tells us that for some reason he was kicked out and his name struck from the from all annals and from the histories, from the temple histories, which is one way to put it, but since this is a source from inside the temple, this makes total sense. We then later on learn that what actually happened when Anamander Rake talks with Ganua's Paran for whatever reason. And he basically explains that, or am I completely wrong? No, I think it's Anamander Rake who tells that to Paran, which not to Paran, to Whiskey Jack, obviously. And now we have that whole tale that what really happened was that for political reasons, the Empire got involved, the Claw got involved, and for political reasons managed to get Heborik kicked out of the temple. We learn about how the Rev works. And this is a thing that Erikson does often, and so let's go into that for a moment, because we first we get that like source. I mean, we first meet Heborik. We know that he's lost his hands as a kind of punishment for whatever crimes within the temple. Then we get that epigraph. A book later, we get that epigraph as a chapter heading, and then we get to witness the punishing of Rathfener, where they do the same thing, where Ikovian does the same thing. He invokes the Rev, which, as far, I don't know how to exactly translate the Rev, but yeah, these religious vows, the religious construct, I think it's sort of, I guess, similar to the monastic rules that different monastic orders follow in a way. If you understand what, you have like the Benedictine rule, you have the Franciscan rule, the Dominican rule, the Jesuit rule, whatever, for like Catholic monks. And they are all different, but once you join that kind of organized religion, that religious organization, that those are the rules you have to follow in a way. Anyway, so he invokes those and does the whole kicking him out kind of thing, which is to chop off the hands of the high priest. Now we know from Dedos Gates why it's the hands that have to be chopped off, because it's this idea that you have the feathered symbol, like the tusks, tattooed on the heart, and you have to press your hand on your heart, and then that's how you kind of actually connect that circuit. It makes magic very much sound like electricity at this point. But yeah, you do that. So you cut off the hands, and then something happens with the hands. They vanish. And then we see how some kind of alien scripture takes over the entire body of Rathfener, who then dies horribly because the alien power that's flowing into him is so terrible. And why is that the case? See, that's what I mean, how these things like circle around, is that then in the next scene we have Anamander Rake explain it to Whiskey Jack, explain how the Rev of Fenner works, which is works. God, I'm starting to sound even more German than usual. Anyway, which is that the hands are then taken by Fenner and lie at the hoof of Fenner, obviously not the feet, because he's a boar, and not the boring kind. Yeah, sorry. And, so they land with him, and then Fenner, uses like these scriptures or whatever that then flow over the body that the hands got chopped off, to make this connection between the god and the I don't want to say ostracized, because ostracism obviously works different, but yeah, the shunned or thrown out priest, to have that connection, because once that priest dies, he's then he's then called to Fenner, who will judge him, I suppose. And that's what obviously didn't work with Rathfener, because Fenner has been kicked out of his realm, pulled out of his realm, which we kind of heard before in Deadhouse Gates, but we didn't know why this works. And the idea is that there is this connection between the god and the person, and once and that goes like into both directions. And once Heborik had these, they touched the jade statue, he had that chaotic power to actually draw on Fenner and pull Fenner, or push in this case apparently, because Anomander X says push, but so that goes into both directions. But now that Fenner is no longer in his realm, the hands were sucked up by something, we don't know what. And that's how the thing with Wrath Fenner works. And as I said, I don't want to go too deeply into the lore part of this. I just want to look at the structure. It's like first we get shown the results of the thing, if it works, which is when we meet Heborik and we learn about all the stuff that happens to Heborik, but we get like basically no explanations from Heborik in Deadhouse Gates. Then we get the temple perspective. Then we see how the Rev is actually performed. And then once all of that has happened, and we have basically all the pieces ourselves, we basically have all the pieces at that point. Then we get the perspective where Anamana Rake ties it all together. So we can then finally completely understand what worked there, what didn't work, and why we are where we are now. So that's just something that Stephen Erickson does a lot of times, and if you realize this kind of structure in a lot of his writing, I guess you can sometimes, maybe it makes it easier to follow some of the narratives and some of the plots and developments if you're aware of this like circular writing, I guess, or circular plotting or building up of certain information in a way. It's like you show first, and then you show the next bit and the next bit, and then in the end you circle around and tie it all together with that narrative about Heborik, which is where it begins and then ends again. And in the middle we have the other stuff where we see have these temple sources and see the Rev performed on Wrath Fenner. So yeah, that was one thing I just wanted to, look at how that structure works there, which is well done, obviously. All right, what else do we need to talk about? Civilization, imperialism, and order and chaos. Now, that's something we need to look at. There's a lot to unpack there, and I suspect there is even more to unpack once we are done with the entire series. Well, not I suspect, I know. But yeah. And that is the whole idea of first that discussion between Whiskey Jack and Corlat, and then Anomander Rake's explanation to Brood and Calor and Corlat about the pretend outlawing of Dujak's army. Why is this interesting? It's like the idea that the Malazan Empire takes over continent after continent and so forth, and Brood has fought as a liberator, so he sees it as a liberator to prevent the people on Janabakis from being occupied and downtrodden and ruled by an outside influence, the Malazan Empire. Now we come to the point where the allies, Brood, Calor, Ray, Corlat, have figured out that the outlawing is apparently just a pretense to make the alliance workable and possible. And they get super angry and feel like the result will be they kill the Panyan Doman, destroy the Panyan Seer, and then the Malazan Empire just takes over the entirety of the Panyan domain, and that enrages Calor and Brood. And then we have Anamander Rake explaining that the Malazan Empire, while obviously bringing like rule and like taking over and occupying countries, it has brought to the parts that it has conquered in the recent times on this continent, on Genebakis, which is Genebaris and Nathilog, apparently. It has brought wealth, prosperity, and order and calm to these places. People's lives in general seem to have improved under Malazan rule compared to what was before. And this is important from like a utilitarian ethical view. Occupation by the Malazan Empire is good. And now this is something that is terrible because it's something that you see when it comes to the justifications of imperialism everywhere. It's like, it's how the British Empire or the Germans or whoever, colonized and created colonies in, whether it was India or was in some places in Africa. That is always a justification, is you bring those places peace and prosperity and civilization, because obviously the Malazan Empire bring bureaucracy, working bureaucracy, technological progress, and so forth. That has always been the justification. Now the problem is, in like our world in during the times of colonialism, if you consider that they're like over right now, at least on paper, there have been a lot of problems with that. I mean, there are a lot of moral problems with that, but also the bringing justice, peace, and prosperity to other places has, in almost all cases, been bought at like the price of economical exploitation that people in those places suffered from up until today, and will suffer from for the foreseeable future, because under the guise of bringing civilization, there usually was mostly ruthless exploitation. Does the Malazan Empire do the same? We don't know. So far, we've seen that at least in 7 cities, that is the case. There's corruption, there's exploitation with the taxes and so forth, and it has led to rebellion. Now, this may also be the case because apparently the 7 cities civilization is far older and more coherent in a way than what we see on Genebakis, where you have all these city-states and the Rivi tribesmen, and it's a much more culturally diverse place than 7 cities seems to be, which would probably make a coherent resistance or whatever against the Malazans much more difficult, obviously. Well, there's the point. From Rake's perspective, occupation by the Malazan Empire is, from a utilitarian perspective, is a good thing. It brings peace and prosperity, because apparently, if it works well, the Malazan Empire does those things and does not just bring terrible exploitation, economic exploitation, and exploitation and corruption and atrocities against the natives. It does not do those things if done well. And he then explains that it brings order. And this is like the second part, which it kind of goes out of that, because on the one hand, here you have a clear argument on paper, for imperialism and for colonialism. Does it work that well? That's like the other part that we need to talk about at some point, and that Erikson has shown us in a way in 7 cities and might show in other places as well. The reality is unfortunately not the same as theory. And in theory, what sounds good in theory does not always work out in reality. That's sort of one of the points that we will see later again. That's why I said that we will return to this issue again and again. The second part is the order versus chaos versus individual freedom discussion that Rake kind of takes out of that, because what he says is His argument is that a strict order under a Malazan rule brings a certain level of freedom and agency to everyone for the price of the curtailment of freedom of extremely powerful individuals like Anand Rake, like Kaladin Brood, like Kalor, who are obviously, in this case, extremely powerful on a personal, magical, and whatever level. But you can look at that from, like, in a real world equivalent, you would probably need to look at it as an economic thing, and see people like Rake or Calor or Brood as extremely economically powerful people who have, like, through their power and influence, to them living in a ordered society becomes a hindrance. It becomes a chain because it weighs them down, because they could afford all the they can afford, like, from their power level, from their power, or as I said, like in real world, you would probably have to look at economic power there. They don't need a overarching structure enforcing peace and prosperity, because they are powerful enough to always guarantee peace and prosperity for themselves and the people the ones they choose to actually take into their, like, umbrella of power. So for them, living in this kind of orderly structure is actually a loss of freedom, where it is probably a gaining of freedom, a gain of freedom for people who don't have that level of power. And that's a very, very interesting argument there on a lot of ethical and philosophical levels. And I think we should come back to that at another time as well. But I just, like, it's the things that just, like, are dropped in the middle of something that on the surface is just a discussion about whether to actually confront the Malazans because of their treachery or not. And the way that is handled is just extremely well done, I think. I also want to point out that discussion they had before, Corlat and Whiskey Jack had before that, because obviously there it gets extremely personal. Because of the relationship that Whiskey Jack and Corlat have going there. And I find it interesting that they start that discussion also on liberty and liberation and freedom. And you see Whiskey Jack explaining that he's for all those things, and then Corlat confronts him with the suspicion that they are actually not as outlawed as they pretend they are. He has no choice but to basically lie to her, or retract all the things he has said before, which, since they seem to be his personal conviction as well, leave him in this, like, weird, I don't want to say double bind situation, but it's that situation where he's doing something against his own better judgment because he's forced to do it, and that leads him into that confrontation with Corlat. And I like the way this is handled, because it shows how once you are, as an individual, in these kinds of overarching structures as a military commander within this larger military world and so forth, your personal convictions and your private convictions and your personal relationships all crush or are crushed or are in constant danger to be crushed by that larger overarching structure that you are within. That, on the other hand, also gives you and your life meaning. Whiskey Jack wouldn't be Whiskey Jack if he weren't a Malazan officer and soldier. So this makes it, like, goes back to that thing that I'm always ranting about, which is the idea that the question of individuality, in, like, what can the individual do in the face of, like, outside influence and outside structures, that kind of goes back to that. I just I just felt it was really well handled in that situation, and I felt sorry. I felt sorry for both in that situation. I felt sorry for the Corlat, and I felt sorry for Whiskey Jack, because it's so often when you if you okay, so the problem that this shows is like that you have when you are in a relationship with another person. It is extremely easy for everyone from the outside to see where those conflict points come from, and where that conflict comes from, and how to actually solve these situations. But once you are locked in your personal viewpoint and all of that, you have no choice, and those conflicts will arise, and then it's extremely difficult to actually solve them. So to watch that kind of conflict and see it from the outside, and see how actually the inevitability of the whole thing, that was, if it's scary and it's sad, but it works, is what I'm trying to say here. So yeah, I guess I'll cut it here for today. I'll be back with something tomorrow, and something on Monday, on Sunday, and something on Monday, and Monday will be the return. I suspect it's either going to be tomorrow, or it's going to be on Monday, the return to Memories of Ice. And then there's going to be something else tomorrow. And on Sunday, it might involve mythology, possibly, and ancient history, and Malazan as well. All right, until then, cheers.